Welcome to our afternoon masterclass. My name's Bernadette Wood and I'm one of the Directors Practice Support in the Office of the Senior Practitioner. Before we start this afternoon, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Barramadigal people of the Eora Nation, elders past, present and emerging, and a special call out to any Aboriginal staff here today, working hard every day for their communities. The purpose of today's masterclass is for me to get our fabulous panel up on stage in a moment and use their expertise to discuss each of their different practice approaches and demonstrate how they can work together. You've heard each of our panel members deliver a keynote address, so you know a little bit about them already. So let's just welcome to the stage Sue, Andrew, Allan, Shelly and David to come and take their seats. So we're going to be using a case scenario that is hypothetical, where the father is using violence, the children have been hurt, and there's a need for safety planning. So there is a copy there, but I know it's dark and I'm going to read it out in case you can't see what you're looking at. So this is our report. Blake is 13. He lives with his mum, Kim, 30, his stepfather, Tom, 41, and his sister, Alice, 7. Last night, Tom found out that Blake has been skipping school and yelled at him and tried to attack him. While Blake and Tom were fighting, Blake got knocked to the ground. Kim got hit by a bottle and lost consciousness and was badly cut across the face. Blake called the ambulance. When the ambulance and police arrived, they noticed a lot of empty wine bottles in the kitchen and the house was a mess. Blake was with his mum, trying to stop her bleeding. Alice was in her bedroom. Tom was sitting out the back of the house, calmly having a smoke, occasionally yelling and swearing back at Blake and Kim for causing all the drama. Tom was arrested by the police. Kim was taken to hospital. Hospital staff told police that Kim was very intoxicated, incoherent, slurring and agitated when she arrived, crying about Blake. She was difficult to treat and had to be sedated. Another police officer took Blake and Alice to stay at their Auntie Claire's home. Blake told the police officer that Tom fights with his mum and him a fair bit. He has hit, pushed and kicked him and his mum lots of times before, but he doesn't hit Alice. Alice started crying and asked if her dad was going to jail. Kim is still in hospital and she will be there for at least a week after the surgery on her cheek. Tom has been charged and granted conditional bail. He is not allowed any contact with Kim, Blake or Alice until after the next court date in a month. The children are staying with Claire for the time being. Tom has told the police he doesn't want Kim getting the kids back again when she gets out of hospital because she's a useless mum when she's drinking. So our history on the family is that FACS have received 2 previous Roche reports. The first report was about 5 years ago about Kim's drinking when Alice was a toddler. Kim attended the community health centre for help with Alice's sleeping. The nurse noticed that Kim was slurring her speech and unsteady on her feet. She disclosed that she was drinking because she was stressed out and tired. She said Alice was not a good sleeper at all and the house was stressful. Her son didn't get along with her partner and her son was being difficult, playing on their relationship. She felt that if Alice would just sleep better, they would all be getting along better and they all wouldn't be so tired. Alice was referred to a sleep clinic and Kim was diagnosed with postnatal depression. She agreed to a referral for alcohol counselling and to continue visits with the community health when she needed. The report was not allocated and closed. The second report was 2 months later. Kim attended alcohol counselling with a bruised side of her face. The worker asked her what happened, and she said she was tired from Alice not sleeping, and she'd walked into a tall bookcase. She said she hadn't been to the referred sleep clinic as she couldn't leave her son overnight with her partner. The worker noticed other marks on her arms and neck that looked like bruises, but didn't ask about them. Alice was napping in the pram during the visit. She looked small for an 18-month-old, but healthy. The report was closed without allocation. Kim is the eldest of 3 children, and Kim's family were well known to fax when she was a child and teenager. There is a lengthy history of alcohol and violence by Kim's father. Kim frequently ran away from home and was often reported to the police. She became pregnant and had Blake when she was 17. Tom moved to New South Wales with his mother when he was 15. There is no fax history for him as a child or adult. Kim was 18 when she met Tom, who was 28. Kim moved in with Tom, and they had 1 child together, and that's Alice. So what we're going to do is spend some time in the next hour and a half thinking about, talking about, and planning how we would meet with, talk with, and help Kim, Tom, Blake, and Alice, and better understand what's going on in their family and how to help them. We can't do our best in understanding what's happening to a family or assessing the safety of the children if we don't listen to the stories of the family, and if we go out with our minds made up or ideas of our own. Knowing what we know so far, I'm going to ask our panel to talk. So Sue, we're starting with you. In preparing to talk to Tom about his violence and Kim, Blake and Alice, what assumptions do we need to be thinking about and watching ourselves for?
So I tend to think of multiple balls in the air. This is where I'm tuning into my colleagues, even though they're inattentive to my tuning into them. You just missed that, really? So I was talking about the balls in the air. Right. So one of the things that may be worthwhile to be conscious of is to suspend any judgment or conclusions about Blake's behavior. There was quite a lot of description of his behavior where we have a fair amount of incomplete information regarding function with what he is communicating in that way. Perhaps avoid organizing around the descriptions of Kim's alcohol use, unless I missed something. I'm unsure whether that was, ever, conclusively screened in, and there may be the kinds of incoherence and slurring and agitation could indicate a number of different conditions or have, again, other kinds of functions in play. And refrain from assuming that the violence, even though it's sort of languaged in that way, was between Tom and Blake, sort of leading us down a pathway that we'd want to guard against regarding some sort of mutual combat. Recognize that relationships are more complex. It's rare that each person is either all this or all that. And so until we have, the views of everyone involved in terms of the nature of their relationships, it's a gray area. A couple of last things: avoid assuming that Alice is unaffected or less affected because she was in the bedroom. Again, thinking about everyone in the family and their experiences. Be open to this is what I think about in terms of the work that the two of you have talked about. Be open to the presence of protective behaviors that may be far less visible and may lead us down a different pathway of conclusion. And consider pattern and history. David, I'm thinking about you in this context. Pattern and history may indicate a much longer-term behavioral pattern in terms of Tom's violence and control against Kim.
Thank you. David, what do you think should be our first steps and priorities in thinking about responding to Tom's violence and Kim and the children's need for safety?
I have a couple of things I think about when I look at this. One is, and this will carry through, I think, the whole set of the scenario, which is, I would be interested in what the worker's practice is and what the supervisor's practice is. And the descriptions that you read that we have are very much about what the family's saying, but not describing what the worker's doing. And I think given the focus of the conference and the work, that to keep an eye on sort of how is the worker working and what kind of suggestions might we have for them is important. One of the first things I would do with a case like this is really consider, and I think Sue alluded to this, which is look at what we know about his pattern based on already what we have shared with us. And also look at, I know Sue talks about this, what's known and what's not known, because there's a lot of unknowns about his pattern. You know, for instance, the scenario talks about he has no facts history, but doesn't make it clear whether there's any known criminal history, for instance. So that might be another source of information about his pattern. And to make the distinction, if I was coaching or consulting on a case like this, that there's a big difference between engaging somebody and using a perpetrator pattern-based approach. You could sit down with a piece of paper right now and list out all the things that we think we know about his behaviors. Now, they're coming from multiple sources, but we would want to be looking at sort of the reports around the violence itself, this incident, what he did, what's missing, what's unknown is actually what fighting looks like at this point based on this report. So you'd want to know that, if you were coaching somebody around this, you want to be exploring, well, what did that fighting look like? What exactly did he do would be one of the questions you want to answer. So there'd be a lot about looking around the patterns and understanding this isn't a violent incident by itself. And one of the points that you could use to make that is that he's told the police that he doesn't want Kim getting the kids back when she gets out of the hospital because she's a useless mom and when she's drinking. So you begin to get a sense of how he's leveraging the kids. And this is ultimately a case that might end up in family court where he says, I've got a good job, she drinks, give me at least Alice. I mean, so you're being aware of the dynamics of this. And the last thing that sort of a pattern-based way of thinking directs me is the placement of the children with Claire, who is his sister. We don't know anything about her role or relationship to his violence. Is she a supporter of it? Or is she, it comes out actually later in the scenario, or is she a support for mom and the kids? So at this moment in time, you really need to keep this question about relative placement open because if you place kids with his family, for instance, it may give him full unfettered access to the children, even though the design of the placement is to keep the kids safe.
Thank you. Allan, I'm wondering what you think about the language in the reported information, and maybe you could give us some examples of how we could reframe it.
Is this on?
Yep.
Okay, too bad for you folks, but there it is. Well, in the first paragraph we're looking at, I don't know if you have that, but and Sue alluded to this, they were fighting, it's a mutualizing description, obviously problematic when you have an adult and a child, to talk about things in that way. Blake got knocked down. No, he was knocked down by Tom. Tom didn't get hit by a bottle. He got hit by Tom, using a bottle, and he didn't lose consciousness, he was knocked out. So we have, if you find this in a report, you have to kind of wonder about the assumptions of the worker writing the report. You have to think about, are they mutualizing violence? Are they seeing it as, is accurate descriptions? Are accurate descriptions important? And so that's an interesting kind of practice issue, because if you mutualize, you then split the responsibility between the two, and it looks like Blake is already being blamed by Tom. It's probably not a good idea that he's blamed also by the worker, by the social worker. The other, one of the other things about language, Kim is diagnosed with postnatal depression. She's been diagnosed also with alcohol problems. I think it's possible she could be suffering from postnatal oppression. And she's sad as hell about that, and she's not depressed. She's sad and despairing about being violated. That would be a form of resistance. So what's happened is her resistance has been turned by the doctor into a mental disorder. That empowers Tom. That becomes part of the power dynamics. So a lack of analysis of violence empowers Tom to say, see, like, she's really kind of fucked up, She's got depression, she's emitted this and that. So I'd want workers to feel independent-minded enough to really think about that differently and talk with her about that differently. She probably also had prenatal sadness. And as you know, that sometimes when you get with a person initially and they're great, you have a lovely time in the beginning of a relationship, possibly. We don't know that, but that might be the case. We're checking out. And then they start to become violent and then you get pregnant. It can be pretty disheartening to find out that you're now bonded to that person for the rest of your life. That often gets called postnatal depression. So I'd want workers checking that out. And another thing that stands out, Kim's family were well known to facts. So Kim has been involved, been with institutional responses related to violence most of her life. So I'd want to be talking with her a little bit about, so when these folks first got involved with you and your family when you were a kid, did anyone actually stop the violence? How did they work with your father? How did they protect your mother? Because it looks like she started to becoming the focus of interventions very early on. And there's nothing in the scenario that leads me to think that the people perpetrating the violence have been the focus of interventions. It looks like the work has been aimed at the people who've been victimized, not at the people doing the violence.
Thank you. Shelley, I'm wondering what makes you curious about the family and what would you be more interested in?
Yeah, carrying on from what Allan's saying around the social responses that Kim and Blake particularly have received as direct victims of Tom's violence, I'd be interested to know who else knows about what is happening in this family. Who have they told? And if so, if they have told people, so for Kim, friends, family members, and for Blake, friends, maybe extended family members, Auntie Claire, school teachers, how have those people responded to him? What have they done, not done, said? Who's been helpful, not helpful? And then as a result of that, what has Blake done? Has he become more talkative or not talkative at all? And similarly for Kim, what has she done? So as Sue and David have said, what's the pattern of this over time? This isn't just one incident. There's reference to violence against Kim when Alice was just a baby. A worker noticed other marks on her arms and neck that looked like bruises, but didn't ask about them. So something's been going on for a long time.
Yep, thank you. Andrew, from a practice perspective, in the context of thinking about the children's safety, how would you prepare for talking with Tom, Kim and the children?
I assume I'm never going to be doing the interviewing. So I'm going to assume that I'm leading a group supervision with a team, which is what I do a lot, with these sort of... So I'll speak to that if I can. First thing I'm going to want to do is just get everybody, review the information, narrate your danger statement, safety goal, safety scale, to set up, everybody reads, and let's see how we're all analysing what's making this an open gaze, what do we need to see to close it, and setting up a scale. But those things, I want them all written so we could bring them to Mum and Dad, to Tom and Kim. Then I want to have a conversation about bottom lines. Okay, we've got a month, that the court said he can't have contact, is out, and I'd probably be testing my own bottom line, which is he needs to move out before we can, if I don't mind if they're looking to stay together or separate, but to be looking at the safety planning process, bottom line is he needs to move out. But I'd explore that as a group. Is that something this organisation, this team, this supervisor, this director can get behind or not? So I'd test that. then I'm just going to get everybody writing questions. Now, just to back up danger safety goals, I will write my own. I was very aware of what Allan talked about, the mutualising language. She got hit by a bottle and knocked out. It was like this bottle came out of the air. So if that language is there, I say, well, who's the actor here? What's that saying if we just say, she got hit by a bottle and knocked out? So I'm going to test that. How could we write that so that it's,
Better.
But then lots of questions, particularly relationship questions. I want us particularly to prepare for the interview with Tom. I want lots of relationship questions. For example, what would Alice tell us she most loves to do with you? What would Tom say? Blake say he most loves to do. What would Alice say was most scary about that incident? What she said. And like lots and lots of relationship questions to help the worker who's going to.
Great.
And everybody reading.
Thank you. Okay, so you, the caseworker, has arranged to meet with Tom at the family home. The kids are at school and they're still going to Claire's house at night. Tom has taken a few days off work and has agreed to meet with you. So let's hear from Tom.
When I get angry, I mostly take it out on Kim and Blake. I feel so disgusted and angry when I see Kim drinking. I do it to teach her a lesson and help her make her a better mum. I'm away so much and I worry that if she's drunk, she's not looking after the kids. When I come home and see the mess in the house, I know it's true and I'm right to be worried. But sometimes I wonder if that's really why I'm so angry. I can't accept Blake as my son because the guy raped Kim, just like my mum was raped and abused by my dad. A part of me knows it's not fair, but Blake just presses my buttons all the time. He's been skipping school and talking back and disrespecting me, and I won't put up with it. I've provided for him for all these years, but he's trouble, and no one else would want him. Blake needs to be taught how to behave properly. Kim lets him get away with too much. She's too soft on him, or probably too drunk to notice. Last night, Blake went too far again, being back-chatting and thinking he'd get away with it. I didn't mean for Kim to end up in hospital, but she interfered, and Blake just kept going and Kim got in the middle. My sister Claire's helping look after the kids. My family's from Queensland, and I don't see my mum much. My dad died a few years ago. Claire knows Kim is a drunk. She helps Kim with the kids when I'm away. My dad used to drink a lot too. When Mum started nagging him about it, he would hit her to make him stop. When I got older, I would stand between them and Dad would just hit me instead. Sometimes I got hurt, but it felt good to know I could protect her. I work in the employment industry and spend lots of time travelling away from home. I like my job. I'm respected at work, but I keep to myself. I don't spend time or socialise much with the people from work. I know I should be happy with my job and my family, but I feel angry all the time. Sometimes I try to work out why I'm so angry, but I don't really know. When I'm on the way home from work, I tell myself that I'm happy to see Kim and the kids and I won't be angry when I get home. I hate myself when I hurt Kim. I think I'm happiest and calmest when I'm outside in the backyard or in the bush. We're out at the oval or the park. I love taking Alice for bushwalks. I don't want to lose her and I'm scared Kim will leave me. I try to make Kim stay by telling her I'll kill her if she tries to leave.
Okay, so we've spoken to Tom and he tells us that he hits Kim because he's angry and disgusted at her drinking and wants to teach her a lesson. He worries about Alice when Kim is drinking. He can't accept Blake as his son. He knows it's unfair, but he can't stop it. He thinks Blake is trouble and needs to be taught how to behave. He didn't mean for Kim to get hurt, but she got in the way. His own father was violent in his childhood, and he would sometimes get hurt. It's important for us to slow down and reflect each time we gather information. Each family has many stories and many perspectives, and it's important we understand them all in order to assist them to find the best path forward. David, when we think about our response to Tom so far, what are the best ways that we can go about continuing to engage with him and help him take his responsibility for the violence on Kim, Blake and Alice?
So a couple of things that, again, stand out for me. One is going back to this point about the practitioner. And I want people to reflect upon, if you were the worker going to meet with Tom, one, what would be the safety issues you might be considering for yourself? Would you be worried about your own safety? How would that be handled? What we're finding is that there's a really tight connection between workers' sense of safety with engaging perpetrators and their willingness to have powerful conversations with them, meaningful conversations with them, and I'll use the word confront, and people struggle with that word, but sort of intervene with them, discuss, talk directly. We can use a lot of different words, but about their behavior. And a lot of times those conversations become elliptical when they don't need to be, because the worker hasn't really discussed their own safety with their supervisor or really kind of engaged with that question. So that's one bit. The next bit is really, if you imagine yourself talking to him, and this is tied back to confidence and safety, would you start the conversation with Tom by saying, I'm here because you and Blake got into a fight? Going back to the language points that were made by my colleagues. Or would you say, I'm here because we got a police report that you assaulted your stepson or you assaulted your wife? And that's really the questions about, again, about confidence, around safety, around directness, about naming the behaviors. So bringing what Allan and Shelly are talking about into the conversation in a way that, for me, is in alignment with dignity, because it's really about directness and clarity and not getting pulled into collusion with him right from the start, and trusting it could be a meaningful conversation. The next thing that I would just really notice and ask you to think about is that the worker, whatever they were doing, Tom was willing to give new information about his violence to them, to this person. And to me, that often means that there's something good going on in that interaction. But it's also important to remember that Tom gave a new piece of information, which is, I've threatened to kill her. Nothing else should let you forget that fact. And that if he's threatened to kill her if she leaves. So anything related to separation, so at this point, one of the questions is, if there's an order in place to separate them, is he respecting the order? Is he actually escalating in his dangerousness? What's her response? This is going back to what Shelly and Allan said yesterday. You know, what is her resistance to this? Which might look like, drop the order, vary it, I want to be back with him, I love him, which often people really struggle with. So I would want to keep all those things in mind, and then to remember his presentation at this moment is about himself, not about anybody else, by the way. He's not demonstrating any insight into the impact of his behavior on other people in this interview. So all these things are things I would keep in mind if I was coaching or consulting on this case, and then we're directing the worker to, okay, so now based on that, we do see a little bit of reflection in him. How can we kind of work with that? But never forgetting that foundation. If we get caught in, he's a trauma survivor, and we get focused on this is what happened to him as a kid, that becomes the major frame for the intervention. Then we're going to miss safety. We're going to miss what he's not saying. All those things are really important.
Thank you. Allan, some practitioners might be worried that in responding to Tom in a way that recognises his dignity, we might end up minimising his violence against Kim, Blake and Alice. How would you manage that in your practice?
If we want to have some kind of a frank conversation with Tom, we've got to make it clear from the very beginning that we're going to take the time to listen to him and treat him as a human with legitimate concerns, even though he's behaved violently. And if we want him to be in any way frank and honest with us, he has to see that we're prepared to do that and uphold his dignity as we do it. The notion that kind of shaming and blaming people gets them to be more responsible is, I mean, it would be laughable were it not so tragic. Mm-hmm. No one behaves better when they're treated worse. So one of the first questions I'd ask him would be, I might preamble, I might say, look, I realize this is a very this is a very difficult time. You've been away from your family for a long period of time, and at some point we're going to have to talk in quite a lot of detail about your actions, about what you've done. But I have a few things I'd like to ask you before we get there, if that would be okay. And so one of the things I'd start with is, I'd say, what are your concerns at this time? And in asking that question, I hope to convey to him that he's a human with legitimate concerns, and he has concerns about his kids and about his life and his own behavior. And then I want to spend the time listening to that. And I'm hoping that he'll say some of the things that he said here. For example, he said, he's not really sure if that's he's angry about, Kim's drinking, but he's not really sure if that's the reason for his violence. He's got a lot of uncertainty in a way. So I'd want to ask him, what's got you thinking that Kim's behavior actually may not be the real reason for your violence? Could you tell me a bit more about that? Because he's already puzzling over why he's doing what he's doing. He's proud that he stood up to his father, but he hates the fact that he's violent. So what is it about being violent to your partner and to Blake that you hate so much? How old were you when you started hating violence? This wouldn't be treating him as a traumatized person. This would be tapping into his pre-existing sort of orientation. He has a long history of trying to stop violence, doesn't he? So, I'd be asking questions like, tell me a little bit more. You said you feel responsible somehow for your violent behavior. You feel responsible for hurting Sue. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? How is it that you're feeling responsible? I'd want to know, was your father proud of you when you stood up to him? Even though he hit you? When you stood up to your father, how did your mother respond? How did she feel about the fact that you were trying to protect her? I'd want to ask those questions because he's mentioned it's important to him. It's the way he's making sense of his behavior now. He seems to be making sense of it as though his present-day behavior is an effect, somehow, of that experience. But he's also doubting that. So I think that the doubt that he has about his own motivations is our point of entry, because he's thinking more and more about what's actually going on for himself. How did your mother respond? What is it that, how does your partner respond when she sees her son standing up to you? What does it mean to her that her son is trying to stand up to you and stop you being violent to her? So those would be questions I'd want to use as a bit of a preamble, and then I'd say, so I wonder if we could talk a little bit more in detail about what's actually been happening. The other thing I'm noticing here is that he's socially very isolated, and he's talked about being socially very isolated. So that's, he hates himself, he's socially very isolated, he's been outed for being violent, he hates the fact that he's being violent. I'd also want to be thinking about self-destructive behavior, and I'd probably want to ask him some questions around suicide risk.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, super caseworkers, you've done that. Having spoken to Tom, you're planning to visit Kim at the hospital. Kim is upset about the police being called and facts being involved. After initially being very reluctant to say much at all, Claire supports Kim and tells Kim and you that Kim needs to accept she can't fix him and it's time to get help. She holds her hand, and let's hear what Kim says.
Yeah, it happened just like the police and Blake said. Tom hit me in the face with a glass bottle. He was trying to attack Blake, so I got in the way. Tom has hurt me and Blake before, but never this bad. We've never had to go to hospital, and the police have never turned up on our front door. We just deal with it ourselves, It washes over after a few days. But Tom's really gotten worse over the years. He punches, slaps and kicks me pretty often now. He tried to strangle me once, but I'm so scared that if I leave him, he'll kill me, just like he says he will. I really worry about Blake, more than myself, I can handle Tom, but Blake steps in now. He tries to protect me when Tom gets like that. I swear Blake provokes Tom on purpose sometimes. I just wish he'd bite his tongue. I worry so much about him getting hurt. When Blake steps in, I push, punch and slap Tom, anything to keep his focus on me. Look, I know I drink too much. I feel really bad about the amount of time I spend drinking and watching telly, but it takes away that sick feeling in my tummy. It helps me imagine I'm somewhere else, just for a little while. I know I actually need proper help to stop drinking, but I don't know who to ask or where to go. I love my kids. I feel so guilty when I shout at them, being too loud. I just feel mucking around. I just worry about all the noise and that it's going to make Tom angry, so I do what I can to keep them calm and quiet. Alice was never a good sleeper. When she was a baby, it was so hard to keep her quiet and sleep in a room. It's still hard. The social workers and the nurses told me it was dangerous for her to sleep with me when she was a baby. But they didn't understand. She was such a bad sleeper, and it was the only way that I could get her to go to sleep. She had to be in bed right next to me. And Tom didn't hurt me as much when Alice was in the bed. I still let Alice sleep with me if I can see Tom's getting angry, because I know he'll leave us alone then. I feel really sad and ashamed when I think about it, what this must be like for my kids. I was 18 when I met Tom. He was 28. Tom was so kind back then, and he promised he'd look after me and Blake. But I noticed a change in him a few months after we moved in together. Sometimes Tom was really happy and loving, but then he'd just become really angry, and he'd shout at me and Blake for no reason. Tom never really liked Blake. I always thought it was just because Blake wasn't his, and that he'd learn to love him eventually. I really don't know much about Blake's dad. I was raped by a friend of a friend at a party. I was only 17. Then I found out I was pregnant with Blake. I thought Tom would be happier after Alice was born, but he kept getting angry. He started to punch me when no one would see the marks. And when I was on the ground trying to cover my body, he'd kick me. I've tried to work out what makes Tom so angry, so I can stop it happening. I've worked out how to tell when he's going to blow up, and I try and keep me and the kids out of the way. To be honest, I was actually pretty relieved when Tom started to go away for work. It gave us all some space.
So Kim tells us that Tom has been hurting her and Blake for a long time. She's scared of him, and she's worried for Blake and Alice. Kim tries other ways to keep Tom calm, but they don't always work. She used to think it would get better, but it doesn't. Now she's too scared to leave. She's drinking too much and not able to be the mum she would like to be. In thinking about what Kim has told us about herself and her family and how it impacts on safety, let me ask the panel some more questions. I like them doing all the talking. Allan, 2 questions for you. Firstly, what resistance strategies are we now aware of that we've spoken to Kim? And then, how can we provide a positive social response to Kim's acts of resistance, even though they might be contributing to an unsafe environment?
Well, I think the first thing I want to do is challenge the assumption embedded in the question you just asked me that her resistance is contributing to an unsafe environment. It's not. Tom's behavior is contributing to the unsafe environment. And so the question presupposes a victim-blaming position. So I would ask a different question of me. But there's obviously all kinds of ways in which she's been resisting. But one of the things she said was he was very kind in the beginning, lovely in the beginning. So I find it helpful to ask usually, what was the first thing you noticed? Can you remember, what was the very first thing that happened that you went, ooh, this is not so good? And the reason for that is you really want to begin to discover how the victim responded and resisted right from the very beginning of the violence, to contest the notion that they missed early warning signs, were somehow tricked into believing in the guy, and so on and so forth, because As you know, many women have been told that they've missed the early warning signs and sent to 16-week psychoeducational programs to develop better boundaries and better see early warning signs. I don't believe women ever fail to see early warning signs. So, but you have to ask a question to find that out. So if you ask, what was the very first thing you noticed? She'll say he started to get angry. What do you mean angry? Well, he started to yell. So then when he started to yell, how did you respond? You remember what you did? And she would say something like, well, I took Blake out of there. I mean, I didn't say anything right in front of Blake because I didn't want to have an argument, but I took Blake out of there, and then I talked to him later. And when you talked to him later, what did he do? Well, then he started to get really angry. So how did you respond to that? Well, now I knew I was in it. You know, so then there would be a whole bunch of things that she would have begun doing to try to prevent Tom from getting angry, try to manage his aggression, try to keep Blake away. There's many examples of all the different ways in which she and Blake have tried to protect one another. And it looks like Tom is trying to break down the mother-child bond, you know? But she and Blake are managing to keep their bond. They're managing to protect one another despite Tom's best efforts. How on earth are they managing to do that? What is it that you and Blake know about each other? How could you know what I mean? That seems like an extraordinary thing to me. The other thing is that she's framed as not leaving, even though Tom says that he beats her up, threatens to kill her because she might leave. So, you know, as somebody said in the conference, I forget who, I'm sorry, but we hold up this idea of women leaving as the ultimate form of resistance, but really that's our invention. And many women leave men emotionally 15 to 20 years before they leave them physically. So she started leaving him emotionally by imagining being in another place, didn't she? So in what other kinds of ways did you begin leaving the situation and begin leaving Tom? Even though you can't leave him physically, you've been leaving him emotionally behind. In what other ways are you taking care of yourself emotionally? So those are some of the questions I'd want to use to
Thank you.
explore. Yeah.
David, when we think about how Kim's relationship with the children has been damaged by Tom's violence, what first steps could we take to support Kim in rebuilding towards a safer place?
I'm going to have to follow Allan's lead here about questioning the premise and the design of the question, because I'm not seeing damage in the relationship between Kim and her children. And I don't want to say, I mean, and Allan makes the point that Tom seems to have targeted that relationship, but really in terms of what she said and what we have written in front of us, there is no facts to point to damage in the relationship. You know, Allan's pointing out there's, in fact, indicators of collaboration, partnership, acts of resistance, planning with the kids, doing all sorts of things. And so, you know, the question has in terms of to support Kim in rebuilding towards safely parenting, I would, for instance, raise the fact that we really haven't assessed her parenting at all. And for instance, not to make the assumption because she drinks, she doesn't take care of the kids. One of the interesting things, and this goes back to gender bias and sort of expectations of women around parenting, is it appears at this point that she functions well as a parent around kids' basic needs. He goes off for periods of time to work. So if we actually ask some basic questions, we're more likely to, or just to kind of pay attention or listen, that she's getting the kids off to school, she's feeding them, or is she getting them to the doctors? I mean, that she's engaging in a lot of really good, my guess is she's engaging in a lot of really good parenting. And I think there's some built-in assumptions that we have to be really careful about to assume that because she drinks, she's not parenting.
Yep.
And I think that's a very common assumption we make to equate drinking or drinking issues. Even her statement that she drinks more than she likes, with it meaning that she isn't doing effective parenting with the kids. So I think there's a bunch of gender bias issues that we really need to look at. So as a practitioner, one of the things I would want to make sure that we said that we kept an eye on is, one is, as Allan said, he's the source of the danger to the kids. And really the primary focus should be on his safe or unsafe parenting. The second thing is to really bring that into action is I would want to make sure that somebody who is working that we're saying to her, we really want to be clear that in this case, we're looking at his behavior as the source of the danger to you and the kids. And this case came to our attention not because of your drinking, but came to our attention about his violence. Now, I can't tell you how many cases I've worked on that came in because of a male partner's violence and became about mom's depression and drinking.
Yep.
So the actual referral disappeared, and the case became about mom's quote-unquote problems. And I think the danger is here. So to make sure that the worker, if we're managing the worker's practice, to say, did you say to mom, we're here because of his behavior, and we're concerned for your safety and the safety of the children based on Tom's behavior. And we want to make it clear to you that your drinking isn't an excuse or a reason for him to get violent. You know, and to be really absolutely proactively clear with her about that, not leave it up to her mind to fill in, because what she's seen as the social response has been, oh, the people don't get it. Like, she showed up or people met with her, those first two reports, what she learned was, people are not going to ask me. They're not going to see it even when there's bruises. Nobody's going to say to me, you know, it looks like I'm concerned that you're being hurt by somebody. Can you talk to me? That may have been all that she needed from that worker earlier to open up in the previous reports. So as I think Allan said earlier, that we have to look at the social responses she's gotten earlier from facts, both in this relationship and prior, and be proactive. We can't leave it up to our imagination where we stand.
Thank you. I'm curious about what life is like for the children in the house. We can only truly understand a child's safety, their relationships, and what they need from us if we talk to them about their experience of life in their family and what needs to be different to keep them safe. Talking with Blake and Alice will give us a better sense of what life is like for them and allow us to be more helpful to them and their safety. So, super caseworker, you arranged to meet with Blake and Alice to talk to them about what life is like in their family and what happened the other night. So let's hear from the children.
My name's Alice. I'm 7 years old. I like school. It's pretty good. I got some kind friends. Sometimes I go and stay with my best friend Casey. She's 7 like me. Casey's mum and dad are nice. They are kind and funny. Casey's mum cooks yummy dinners every night. I wonder sometimes about what it would be like to be Casey. She seems really happy all the time, or what it would be like if I could live with her forever. I like being at school. It mostly feels better than being at home. It's quieter and calmer and I don't feel scared. I like home sometimes. I like being there when Mum and Dad are happy. I don't like it when Dad is angry and hurting Mum. Dad gets cranky when Mum drinks wine. I sometimes see him yell at Mum and hit her. I want to help Mum, but Mum told me not to. She told me what I should do as soon as I hear Dad yelling. Mum told me to go to my bedroom and watch music videos on my iPad. So I try to remember to do that. Sometimes I forget, or I get scared and stand still. I get pretty scared when I hear Dad hitting Mum or hurting her. I wish he would stop. I get really worried about Blake too, because he gets hurt sometimes. I told Blake I want Dad to stop hitting Mum, but he tells me not to. He said that's his job, and it's my job to stay in my room. I usually go and find Blake and give him a hug after all the fighting is finished. He hugs me back really tightly. I wish Dad was happy all the time, the way he is when we go on bushwalks. It would be really nice if Blake could come with us too. Mostly I feel bad for Blake, because Dad isn't very nice to him. He blames him for stuff all the time. I get scared that one day Blake will run away from home and go live somewhere else, and I won't see him again. I think Mum seems much happier when Dad is away for work. I try to keep Dad happy when he comes home. Then he doesn't get mad with Blake or Mum. I try to remember all the good things that have happened that day, so I can tell Dad all about it. Then he will talk to me. Or I find a book for him to read with me. And then he leaves Mum and Blake alone. Sometimes when it's all quiet, I imagine I could fly away in a plane. with Mum and Blake. We'd go to another place, somewhere where we wouldn't get hurt. I think Dad would stay here. In my mind, I can see him on the ground, getting smaller and smaller until he is out of sight completely.
My name is Blake. I am 13. My mum is in hospital. I feel really bad about it. I feel like it's my fault because Tom was angry with me. He found out that I've been ditching school again. I've been ditching school a lot because it's really hard. I don't think I fit in much. I'm different to all the other kids. The teachers hassle me. They have it in for me. They don't like me or actually care about anything else, only if I turn up. They tell me all the time that I don't try hard enough or pay attention, and they put me on lunch detention. I do try, but sometimes it's hard, especially if I'm tired, or if Tom's at home, and if I'm mostly just thinking about Mum being at home with him. It's hard to not think about it when I'm at school. I don't have many friends. I hang out by myself. It's just easier to stay at home. My mum doesn't care if I go or not. Some days she seems to like it when I hang out with her at home. Tom is not my dad. I know he doesn't like me. He makes it obvious all the time. He seems to try and go out of his way just to treat me different from Alice. At birthdays and Christmas, all the time. He blames me for everything that goes wrong all the time, or gets messed up or broken. I don't care. He's a dickhead. I hate him. I can't stand him. Sometimes I get scared of him a bit. I try to stand up to him, to look after Mum and Alice. He shoves and slaps me and says he's going to really hurt me if I keep talking back to him. He thinks I've got a smart mouth, but it's not as bad as what he says to me. I wish Mum didn't drink so much. Sometimes I tip her wine down the sink, but she just buys more. Tom tells me that it's my fault that Mum drinks all the time. He says I never should have been born. I don't tell him he's wrong anymore. I did once. He hit me across the head really hard and then punched Mum in the stomach when he tried to stop him. Sometimes I wonder if it really is my fault, or if maybe I really am to blame. Mum doesn't tell me it isn't. She loves me very much, but sometimes I don't know. When Tom found out I was wagging school again, he yelled at me and tried to bash me. There was a punch-up. My mum tried to stop Tom from belting me. She got hurt. Alice was standing there watching. I could tell she was scared. I yelled at her to go to her bedroom and then tried to stop Mum's face from bleeding. It was pretty bad. I got really scared that she would die. It looked so bad. I felt sick thinking that Alice and me would be stuck with Tom forever. I don't really see any other people in my family. Sometimes I think I would like to know who my real dad is, but Mum won't tell me. She says he was a man she met at a party and never saw him again. I think he's probably a sportsman because I'm good at sport. It would be really nice if he was rich too. I wish Mum would just leave Tom or kick him out. Sometimes when Tom is being a real dick, I think about how cool it would be if my real dad would come and take Mum and Alice and me away from this shithole. Or I would think what my family would be like if Tom wasn't here or he was dead.
Sometimes as workers we worry about talking to children about the sad things that are happening in their family, especially if we think we've got the information already from another source, like the police report or the school. But as you heard from those lovely voices, I think we need to challenge ourselves on this and see how we can really talk to the children and listen to the children for both restoration of dignity, the building of relationships, and for us to really understand their experience, which can only enhance our assessment. Shelly, when you think about the ways that children might resist, I'm wondering about what responses you heard there in those stories, and then for Blake particularly, how should that influence our response to him, and how can we respond to him and support him?
Well, I think the first thing is recognizing the very specific behaviors that both Blake and Alice are demonstrating as forms of resistance. rather than something else and other ways of understanding them. So, for example, Blake is skipping school, and when he does go, he's having trouble paying attention, not fitting in, not making friends, these kinds of things. And that becomes a whole area of concern often, and for Blake himself and his school performance, and then also can become a parenting concern, that his mom isn't supporting him well enough at school and not being a good enough parent in many ways. But what he's telling us is that school isn't a high priority for him in the context of what's going on in his family. And what he's most worried about is the safety of his mom, and when he's at school, he doesn't know what's happening for her. So these very specific behaviors at school and his inability to pay attention at school, or what could be understood as inability to pay attention at school, is actually his very careful attention to the safety of his mom. And so similarly for Alice, in this context, her worry for Blake could be understood as a form of resistance to the violence that's going on in the home. And often we would look at worry as in its own category for kids, and then take it further as an anxiety problem for her, rather than a violence problem for Tom. And so understanding these behaviors specifically as forms of resistance to the violence, and talking to the kids about their experiences and hearing the worry that they have for each other, the relationship between the kids, the relationship for each of the kids to their mom, the variety of ways that they're working to protect each other and their mom. They have a lot to say about that.
Thank you. Andrew, how can we use safety-centred tools to talk with and work with Blake and Alice to better understand their safety and thus get the best safety plan?
Get the microphone at now. First of all, I want to say that if you've got that amount of information from two children, that's extraordinary. And that gives us so many opportunities to do so many things. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is doing, in that group supervision context, setting up an appreciative inquiry process around what the work has done, how they've got that information, what they did. Because once I have more of a sense of how the workers managed to engage them, I've got more sense of what we're doing that's working, that we can build on. And I want the worker to understand that as a parallel process, that we're going to look at what's working to cascade into the safety planning. In terms of working with the children, I think it's really important, and so we need to be clear amongst ourselves as professionals about what are we doing here and how are we going to explain that to the children. So that, one of the things that gets, and we've seen this in our independent research, is the workers came in, did 3 houses, and then left. And the children say, they liked it, but had no idea how that was going to be used, didn't quite know what your role is here. So I think I'd be wanting to work with the workers. Let's get clear and make sure we, in a similar way that David's talking about, being really clear to mum about we're focused on his violence. I want to be really clear with the kids. We're here to make sure you're not in the middle of this stuff again. We're going to work with your mum and dad and everybody around them, and just work with the workers to develop some words for that. It's a very simple thing, but we don't do it. So the kids are left going, well, what was that all about? You know, and what are you going to do with that information now? So it's really important also to be really clear and ask for permission, because I want to use that information to create questions to come to the parents about safety. And I want the children to understand how we're going to do that, but you've got to help the workers do that connecting stuff, not just use tools.
Thank you. Sue, with all that you've heard about the family, how would you use group forums like group supervision to share the risk and the worries?
So I'm going to respond as if we are in a large group supervision context, and I'm going to raise a few things that may be hard to hear. So we're going to lean in and support each other and support Kate, who is going to be working with this particular family. So similar, I think we're all really clear that Tom's behavior is supporting the risk to Kim and the children. We have some indicators about, and David, you raised this, the potential separation of Tom being out of the home, right? And which means that we've lost a pulse on him. And so we need to regain that particular pulse because of the potential lethality that comes from those sorts of separations. And because I come from the US, now we're really clear on that, right? And we have a lot of guns. One of the bits that we're going to have to follow up on is there access to firearms? If we have listened to Blake, he has been very clear in his messaging and potential for taking matters into his own hands. And so it makes a difference in that way, as it does with the potential, and Allan, you raised suicide, and I would look at the potential for homicide, suicide, looking for a couple of key bits of information. So the likelihood of that risk ramping up is really Tom's employment. So when we talk about, I mean, on the one hand, there's some of the challenges around looking at his employment and forgetting to look at some of the parenting. On the other hand, male unemployment and needing to talk to Kim about whether there had been any attempts at choking tend to be the lethality factors that we want to additionally pay attention to in that regard. So Kate will have to reconnect with Tom as soon as possible and approach him. There's likely, as a group, we can talk about a couple of additional approaches. One would be tuning into his attention to the children. So while all of these behaviors in his way, he's using the language of drama, are going on in the home, what does he know about how the children, reacted, or and so we're looking at connectivity in terms of the children with that regard. And then the other is asking him what it is he hopes for, what it is that he wants, because in that we can discover incentives or sources of leverage to then go back and circle back to his behavior, and whether that is moving him toward what he wants or moving away from what he wants. So we do have some information that we have to gather to be able to enact a safety plan with regard to the family there. And then there is also, I think, we want to raise things that are in our heads so that we can find a way to take what's up here and bring it in front of the family. And so one of the potential conversations with Kim that I'm tuning into is in her courageous conversations about her childhood and her young adulthood. She described taking off. I think she actually used the words running away. And it would be important for us to know about her school engagement because the absence of school engagement, along with episodes of taking off, looking at the potential, because it's in my head, of the age difference between them, might that be an indicator of a further pattern of coercive behavior that moves into some of the exploitation and potential trafficking kinds of places and spaces. So there are things that we could talk about in terms of bringing people together around a conference, because I think our time is too short to, go into some of the preparation that would be important there. Those, I think, are some of the ways that we would use group supervision to organize that information, to see the gaps, to ensure that we can get clear on whether we have substantial lethality or other factors before we can start to enable some of the other conversations.
Thank you. So knowing all this, we may be challenged to find the time to stop, slow down and reflect and plan what happens next. Sometimes in the busyness of our work, we can be in a hurry to make sense, make plans, take actions, do things for the family. We're a bit like that, aren't we? Maybe it's just me. But what we know is that the next steps that we take are really important in assisting the family to make changes. That our early time with the family sets the tone of the relationship and the partnership that we're going to develop. So Andrew, how would the information from Tom, Kim and the children be useful to us, and how should we think about safety planning? Even if Tom was to stay in the home, what do we need to know or understand more? How might we do that?
Again, I'm going to start with what's working. The amount of information we got and the engagement that happened with both Tom and Kim is extraordinary. If I had that much information off one interview, anywhere in the world, I'm like, hallelujah. We've got so much, so let's just stop for a while. I'm going to have the whole group develop some questions for the word. How the hell did you get all that information? How did you get Tom to talk like that? And we're going to spend some time, because I want to know how the hell she or he got Tom speaking to them. Same with Mum, because that's, relationships are what makes change. So we need to spend time, could say a lot more about that. One of the things we found, and we know from our research, that makes a difference, having a clear trajectory and timeline for the whole work. So right now I'm going to say, okay, let's all map out for the whole work, right through to closure. Okay. And put into a timeline we can put on the table with the family. That was, for example, we did with Will and Grace, the Kate. And they said that's what made the biggest difference. We knew what was all. So, but some of the key things I want would be, we've got to get after networks immediately. I want to be seeing Mum and Dad separately, but I want to be seeing them with people. I need bottom lines to them saying, look, to get these kids back to you, whether you're together or separate, we need networks, we need an explanation, and with your networks you're going to create a safety plan with us that we can tell the kids about. I'm going to start and work on that trajectory. And here's the bottom line, Tom, you need to move out until we get really clear down the track with that end of, are you up for that? So I want to take responsibility as our statutory authority to use that. The whole, we need to assess. I want them involved in the assessment, obviously. So we're taking people through an assessment process, and lots of questions to Tom about the violence, the impact, what's the kids' experience. Same questions to Mum separately with her support people, building off what the kids said. Dad, what do you think Alice has said? What do you think he said? The boy and Blake, etc. We need to to take, there's so many opportunities in there in exploring the drinking with mum, and it's going to start for me by saying, how does the drinking help you? You know, and work from there. You know,
Excellent.
and also explore it from the kids' perspective, but being really clear with what David said, it's the violence we've got to get sorted out. And we'll have a pathway through, but we've got to get after those networks.
Thank you. David, what would the next steps be in safety planning with Tom?
I need this. You know, the question actually challenged me because I wouldn't frame it that way. You know, let's be clear, at least based on the facts that we're getting that are both supported by what Tom is saying and what Kim is saying and what the kids are saying. He's attempted to strangle her, or he's engaged in strangulation, and he's threatened to kill her if she leaves. So there's no question about his dangerousness to her and potentially to the kids at a lethal level. And I think we need to be clear when we're talking about safety planning that that's the level of engagement that we need to consider. And in terms of what's going on, we also need to deconstruct the word safety planning, because I think a lot of times safety planning gets equated with what services are we going to give him. And, you know, for me, as I'm thinking about this and listening to everybody and going through this, you know, really to bring it back to, we have the voices really clearly of Kim and Blake and Alice, really clearly. And I think that they're telling us a lot about how his behaviors impacted them, both emotionally, in terms of safety, in terms of their functioning. And so I would want to make sure that even if we're working collaboratively with Tom, that we would be foundationally in their experience. We haven't really changed anything if their experience hasn't changed. If the kids don't feel safer, we haven't changed anything. If the kids don't have an experience of greater well-being, we haven't changed anything. If they don't have greater stability, we haven't changed anything. And so I think when we think about this, about safety planning with Tom, it's actually got to start with collaboratively working with mom and the kids, if we're going to be allies to them, and ask them questions like, what would make things better for you guys right now? And ask them to define it. Because I think a lot of times we ask the question, what would make you safer? And I think that doesn't always resonate with people. I think the question is, what would make things better? And I think on a very practical level, I want to acknowledge that he's in the family home right now, mom's in the hospital, and the kids are with auntie. So we actually don't know at this point, and there's no court orders anywhere as far as I could tell. So we actually have a real immediate crisis around safety potentially, which is we want mom to go back to her own home. We want the kids to go back to their own home ideally. What is Tom's reaction going to be if we present him with, you know, what Andrew's saying is, we'd like you out of the house even for a short period of time? Is he going to escalate? Is he going to? So I think around that, we would want to work collaboratively with mom and the two kids to say, okay, what happens next? What do you want? What do you think his reaction is going to be? Let's plan collaboratively around the next steps around safety. So I'm not thinking about safety planning with Tom. I'm actually thinking about safety planning with mom and the kids first. And that may step on Alan's question.
Oh, no, that's all right. Allan, where would you go with safety planning?
Yeah.
Andrew was reminded there is a court order via the police, but he's still in the family home.
Yeah.
At least that's where the meeting happened. That's where it was a little bit confusing to me about what the order actually covers. It's a no contact order. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, so how decisive the response is to Tom is tied to how we work with the rest of the family. The first step for me is to talk with Mom about how to talk with Tom. And let her know every step of the way how we might want to try to engage with Tom. What do you think about that idea? Do you think it'd be appropriate to talk with you and your kids together at some point? One of the reasons I'd want to do that is violence really can divide people and turn people against one another. We found it really helpful to talk with moms and kids together about how they've all been responding and trying to take care of one another. which tends to undercut the kind of pathologizing and the blaming that can happen. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you know? And that, of course, when people get divided, that empowers the perpetrator to commit more violence and to commit more harm. So in Canada, one of the things that happens is when there's been a charge, as there has in this case, and there's a no contact order, the accused, the perpetrator, Tom in this case, sort of drifts off someplace. And no one then necessarily engages with the offender, and it could be a long period of time until something happens in court. And in the meantime, nobody really knows and is really engaged. So I think one of the things I'd like to see us do is to, when a person is charged, immediately offer them a voluntary safety planning service. In other words, yes, you've been charged with assaulting your partner. And so we have a service over here run by the court probation, family court services, or what have you, where you can engage voluntarily in a safety planning service. We want to talk to you about, now you've been charged with assaulting your partner and your kids. How is it that you plan to ensure that they're safe until this matter is resolved? So my experience is when I get engaged with men really immediately and just follow that engagement rather than engaging more energetically with the women and the kids, that's a much more important locus of intervention. For me, the locus of intervention should be the locus of responsibility. So it's not her job to plan for safety in a way, it's mine. The other thing about it is we have to make sure as an organization we're up to that ongoing engagement with the person, with Tom. And so that's our safety planning. The other thing is, it seems that she's had a whole series of negative social responses over many years. So I'm wondering about who's her social response network? Who are the people who've been really helpful to her? What are those conversations like? What are those relationships like? Are those people meaningfully in her life in some way, shape, or form? I wouldn't be, if I was going to encourage her to talk with someone else as I'm moving out of the situation, it wouldn't be a therapist, it would be a justice. It would be a justice-oriented organization. So she's already been falsely diagnosed with depression. That's a problem for me. I think she might need to have some other options for how to do that.
Thank you. Shelly, we know that children's voices can be powerful motivators for parents to make change. How would you use what Blake and Alice, we've heard from Blake and Alice, to do that?
Well, again, back to safety, I think we would want to be careful at this point in time around the safety of Blake and Alice with Tom, because what they have to say could be dangerous for them at this moment, depending on what happens and where he's located and where they're located. And so that's something that would need to be checked with them, with Kim, and to know where everybody's going and what their wishes are. Both Alice and Blake are really clear in what they're saying, that what they dream of, what they envision, and we would call this another form of their resistance to what's going on. What you long for and wish for is a form of resistance, really, and is to float away, to be somewhere else, and to be somewhere else without him. And that could be really dangerous for them to say out loud to him. But I would wonder if Kim knows that. And that might be a really useful conversation for the three of them to have together. Not as a motivator for her to do something else, but as a place of connection between them. Because she may or may not know that they're thinking like that. And as much as violence erodes the bond between mothers and their children, it hasn't seemed to be successful between Kim and her two kids yet. But I would worry with Blake at the age of 13 that he could get to a place of being angry at his mom for what he's living through.
Thank you. Sue, how can we check ourselves and our practice to be more aware of our own biases and assumptions and our language and being influenced by the social responses of other agencies and how they talk and act?
So I think some of the most common social responses, that's certainly in the places that I spend most of my time, come from the courts. Why doesn't she leave? And the response is because she's judging it to be safer to stay. Until that is proven different, that would be a typical approach with that. I was also thinking about in a statutory, I might deviate from the question because you can do that when you have the mic, right? You can just sort of say whatever you want.
Feel free.
So in a statutory child protective service context, we must contact him. And so it is the how that you do that. So approaching where possible and safe enough to do so with Kim and having a straightforward conversation with her that we must talk with Tom. What does she think the impact might be on her and the children when we do, and take whatever time is necessary to enact a safety plan in that context. And then in working with Tom, agreed on the context of safety planning. However, yes, we tend to think of it as a control plan for him. He must have a plan because unless the court is involved, and even if they're involved, there's very little accountability at times for men and their violence in the child protective and family violence context. So that becomes a requirement that we would have with that. And there was one other thing that I was going to say. I'm sure it was extremely profound. Let's stall a minute. I could have at least 20 seconds to engage that one brain cell that is still blipping on the screen. Oh, something with the courts and the assumptions that are out there. Yeah, it'll come to me, and then maybe I'll just say, hey, I've got it. And you'll all be okay with that, right?
That'll
it is
be
really
fun.
important, I'm sure.
Okay. And now a chance for you guys to ask the panel your own questions. So if you've got a question for any panel member, put your hand up and wait till a mic comes over to you.
My question is for Shelly or Allan. It's around that question of grooming. I'm probably like a lot of other caseworkers in the room who meet with, families at the point of violence, and we start working with them. But there's from time to time this question in the back of my mind around, am I being groomed, or am I working genuinely with this person, usually the male? And I just wonder if you could speak to that for a minute, get some feedback on that.
Do you mean as a child protection worker?
Yeah, so I mean as a child protection caseworker, working with the family, working with the male in the family, working with everyone, but with the male who's really, there are points where you think, is this genuine? Are we genuinely engaging here?
Charming us.
Yeah, sorry, do you have another term for it?
Predatory entrapment.
Oh, okay. All right.
Good term.
I think it's interesting to think about people who have used violence consistently over a long period of time, particularly, rather than, for example, a one-off so-called incident, and have used violence in multiple ways against multiple people. As Tom has, people who have been using violence a long period of time have also been attempting to manage and manipulate social responses. So, men isolate women, for example, or control money, or take away one shoe, their left shoe of all their pairs of shoes every day in the trunk of the car when they go to work, or all of those kinds of things, not out of some abject or abstract need for power and control, but to actually prevent others from stepping in and helping. So if we think that way, then of course you're always at risk of being, schmoozed, sold a bill of goods, a person lying and trying to manipulate you against their partner, and so on and so forth. So I just think it's a really good thing to be aware of, and I think it's just commonplace, to hide the violence that you've committed. Very few people, when you first talk to them, step right up and tell you everything they've done to their partner. So there's also, though, an element where men who use violence are often really afraid that if they tell you exactly what they've done, and if you learn exactly what they've done, you're going to see them as a non-redeemable human being. They're afraid for their own dignity. So it's an interesting balance between having the time to listen and at the same time, talking with the other people in the situation to make sure that you have a realistic view of what's actually taken place.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and an important question and a risk often, and not one that's easily navigated. It's not something that, because we're working with people, and so there's no clear way to know, which is a theme, I think, throughout the last few days. There's no clear way to know. It's something to stay curious about, and really good use of group supervision when we're involved in these situations. And I arrived in Sydney on Friday last week or something. I don't. Sunday. And the Thursday or Friday before, I was involved in a situation just like that with a very, very violent, I've been working with the woman, but very violent man. And she had a supervision order in place and police involvement and all that. But the child protection worker interviewed him and police interviewed him. Supervision order got lifted, charges got dropped, everything. And this is not that uncommon. So it happens.
If I may add to that a little bit.
Feel free.
I think this is where gender expectations really kick in as well. I think that we have such low expectations of men sometimes about engagement and change, and such a lack of familiarity with working with men that I've seen workers struggle with and say, oh, he cried when I talked to him.
Yeah, that's good.
And that becomes some sort of sacred moment that happened that they shared together. And I often ask, was he crying for getting caught? Was he crying because he hurt people? But even if he was genuinely seemed upset that he hurt other people, don't mistake having remorse or being able to sort of express some empathy with the capacity to change behavior. And to really remember that real change that means something to a victim, adult and child victim, takes tremendous amount of time. And in fact, they're not obligated to stay with him to give him that chance. And a lot of times we see perpetrators wanting to make this kind of deal, which is, oh, I'll go to a men's behavior change program, or I'll sort of engage you, or I'll do this service. But really what I want to do is keep you in my orbit. I want to keep you with me. And that they're just trying a new tactic in some ways to control. So I think it's something we need to be really self-aware about. And we need to have more experiences with watching men who start very resistant to engaging, and watch what real change looks like. Because once we have a template of real change, because some men do change, that really becomes, it makes our work easier picking up manipulation or not from folks.
Thank you. Are you taking the microphone for a reason?
I just remembered.
I saw the microphone come across. I thought I'll just better
And then
check.
my pen failed, and so then I had to take the inside out so I could write it down before I forget. It's bad now. Okay, so this actually does have to do with social responses and thinking more broadly, systemically. So in 1999, we actually built a domestic violence response team into the Child Protective Service system because of some statutory changes and major upheavals. So anyway, in our statutory language, there is failure to protect. And the last time, and I know that holds to be true today, even though they maintain that statutory language, the last time failure to protect was filed was 1999. So we are more likely, if the leverage of the court is needed, and sometimes it is in terms of procedural due process, and sometimes it's strategically needed because Tom could terrorize Kim and the children through different courts around custody and criminal court and order for protection. I'm seeing some nods, so there may be some similarities. And in our jurisdictions, juvenile court trumps the other courts, so we might strategically file, and we would file holding Tom accountable under dangerous environment.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could just add one tiny more thing. That I get a bit fixated on these false diagnoses. I admit it, it's an OCD thing. And, family of origin issues, etc. You know, you can just imagine. Yeah, but that's one of the reasons that these diagnoses are so, we have to be so careful with them, because it'd be very easy for Tom in this situation to be a victim of her deficiencies. Look at all the stress he has to deal with. She's depressed. Then they're having a custody and access dispute, so-called, and he wants Alice, so on and so forth. She gets an MMPI. She's got borderline personality every, 6 days a week. That'll happen in a heartbeat. So that's why us being really careful for the long term around pathologizing her is important.
Thank you. Whilst I would dearly love to keep the panel up here all afternoon, because they're so fascinating to listen to, I'm afraid our time has come to an end. You've heard all our panel members give keynote addresses today and yesterday about the various approaches they've used, and I've hoped that as I've been listening to them today, you can see the great commonalities in a lot of the work that they do. So the things that were common is the partnership approach between us and the mum and the children in that story, that we have to be so careful of language and the language we use and the questions we ask. There's a key focus on behaviour and behavioural questions. There's the ever large challenge of the importance of working with men and not avoiding the challenging, hard conversations, the proper use of language, the hold to accountability. And then there is the focus on group supervision as a way to manage all our emotions and all our anxieties. So lots of commonalities there. But there are many ways to respond to families. I hope that after hearing from them today during our case discussion, you can take away new ideas and new approaches to use in your practice as you continue to grow and develop as a child protection practitioner. Please thank our fabulous panel.